Audio Jungle.
A case that protected the press and media to their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech.
Audio Jungle.
But let's back up and look at what led up to such an impactful decision in libel and defamation cases. So who was involved in the New York Times v. Sullivan case? So first we have the New York Times Company, which is our defendant in the case.
Audio Jungle.
The New York Times is a well-known American newspaper that's been published since 1851. Before this case, the newspaper was known for its investigative reporting and editorial coverage of world news. It was a publicly trusted source.
Audio Jungle.
Next, we have L.B. Sullivan, who was our plaintiff in the case. L.B. Sullivan was the Montgomery, Alabama City Commissioner of Public Affairs in 1960. Sullivan oversaw the city's police department and was a key figure in the local government in Montgomery. He became well known during the civil rights movement for his efforts to maintain segregation. So what exactly happened in the case of New York Times v. Sullivan?
Audio Jungle.
The New York Times published an ad containing factual errors about the civil rights protests in Montgomery, Alabama. Sullivan, who was not mentioned by name in the ad, filed a defamation lawsuit against the Times, claiming that the ad had damaged his reputation. Sullivan argued that the ad published contained false and defamatory statements about his role as a public official. Sullivan claimed that the ad accused him of condoning police violence against protesters. Sullivan sought $500,000 in damages for the alleged damage to his reputation. So what did this ad actually include? The ad actually contained information that was false about the civil rights protesters in Montgomery, Alabama. The ad focused on defending Martin Luther King and the issues of the civil rights movement. The ad criticized the Montgomery Police Department, alleging police brutality and other mistreatments of protesters. The factual errors included were related to the arrest of Martin Luther King Jr. in Montgomery, Alabama.
Audio Jungle.
So when did this all exactly take place? So this case actually started and ended in 1964. Before this case was decided in 1964, state common laws mainly established the legal framework for defamation and libel lawsuits in the U.S. The plaintiff defamation lawsuits were generally favored, mainly cases involving public officials. To prove defamation, a plaintiff only needed to show what a false or harmful statement was made about them, regardless of proof of actual malice. This made it easier for public officials and figures to sue media outlets that publish unfavorable information about them.
Audio
So, because of this case, defamation and libel laws have changed completely.
Audio Jungle.
So before the New York Times v. Sullivan case, it was really easy for public officials to not have to prove actual malice against the media outlets or publishers, and they could just win the rewards and damages. So where exactly did all of this take place? So again, L.B. Sullivan, the plaintiff in this case, filed a defamation lawsuit against the New York Times Company
Audio Jungle.
here at the Circuit Court of Montgomery County, Alabama, seeking the $500,000 in damages. The Circuit County Court found in favor of Sullivan and awarded him the requested damages of $500,000. Sullivan did not have to prove that the Times used actual malice within the alleged defamatory statements. So the New York Times appealed the decision to the Alabama Supreme Court.
Audio Jungle.
So then they went in trial again at the Alabama Supreme Court, where the Alabama Supreme Court supported the lower court's decision.
Audio Jungle.
So basically now the New York Times appealed again to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the verdict violated their overall First Amendment rights. So finally, they took it to the United States Supreme Court, where again, the New York Times argued that the verdict violated their overall First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. The United States Supreme Court reversed the judgment of the Alabama Circuit County Court as well as the Alabama Supreme Court, and held that the First Amendment protected the publication of statements about public officials and figures unless they were made and proven with actual malice. So, how does this affect society as a whole? The New York Times v. Sullivan case has changed the way society views journalism, ethics, everything as a whole. It strengthened our First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech, especially within our press. It changed how we view and receive our information within the press and from the press, particularly about private and figures and officials. If it wasn't for this case, I feel like a lot of information about our public officials would not be as much out there, and we would probably be a lot more in the dark than we are already. So, how did this affect libel and defamation cases going forward? This case, the New York Times v. Sullivan case, has set a standard for defamation and libel cases going forward. It set the standard for public officials and figures to kind of have a harder time having to prove actual malice. It's more on them now, rather than the publication. This case made it more difficult for public figures to sue for defamation and increased the burden of proof required for such cases on the plaintiff rather than the defendant. And this case was significant in establishing the concept of actual malice and the standard for libel cases. Overall, this case has had a significant impact on the practice of journalism and the ability of the press to report on matters of the public interest without the fear of lawsuits or being sued. It has also helped establish the importance of a free and independent press in a democratic society, and has just set standards for defamation and libel cases moving forward.